"You're just the driver," he said, wiping invisible lint from his sleeve. "Not family." That was the first thing my granddaughter's fiancé ever said to me. Not hello, not thank you for raising her. Just that. Just the driver. And then he walked inside, adjusting his perfect tie, his perfect smile, into a house that wouldn't have had heat if I hadn't paid the bills for a decade. I sat back down behind the wheel. The estate was grand, towering pillars, ivy-trimmed gates, soft yellow lights glowing through tall windows. Inside, music floated like perfume. Glasses clinked, people laughed, and I waited. That's what they told me to do. Just park, just wait, just drive. She used to call me Grandpa Joe with stars in her eyes. I used to hold her hand when she cried after her parents' accident. I packed her lunch for first grade. Sat through every talent show, even when she only sang 3 lines. I taught her to ride a bike and then stood in the rain when she crashed it. I never left her side. Until today. Today I wasn't listed as a guest. I wasn't even allowed through the front door. The planner said there were too many names, too much pressure, and they didn't want to cause confusion. My name caused confusion now. She said it wouldn't be for long. Just during the formal part, Grandpa. But her eyes darted sideways when she said it, like she didn't want anyone to see her talking to the man who used to rock her to sleep. I had polished the car, washed the uniform shirt, worn the old blazer she gave me on her graduation day. No one noticed. I watched them all from the gravel, the guests in gowns, the young men laughing near the champagne, her standing beside him, smiling, proud, perfect. And me? I sat behind the wheel, waiting, because that's all I was to them now. Not a father, not a builder, just a man who still knew how to park straight and drive quiet. But something about nights like this, nights where you're invisible in the very life you helped build, they don't pass quietly. They leave a mark, and sometimes they call for justice. And justice, I've learned, doesn't always come through shouting. Sometimes it walks slowly, steps out of a car, and stands. Friends, let me pause for just a moment. Would you mind sharing in the comments? Where are you listening from? Have you ever experienced something like this in your own life? If this story speaks to you, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need it today. Your support truly helps us grow this channel and continue telling stories that matter. Now, let's continue. The security guard didn't even look me in the eye at first. He just scanned the list in his hand, lips moving silently as he followed the columns. Then he stopped, hesitated, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, like he knew what he was about to say wouldn't sit right. "You're not listed under family, just staff." "Just staff?" He said it as if it were a neutral statement, as if it didn't split something inside me, something that had been holding on quietly, stubbornly, for years. He didn't know that my hands had built the crib she slept in after the accident, that I worked 2 extra jobs to make sure she got braces, music lessons, and every book she ever pointed at in a store, that I skipped funerals of my own friends to stay with her when she had the flu, and her mother wasn't there anymore to stroke her forehead, just staff. I looked past the gate, through the glass of the tall doors. People moved like they belonged. They knew where to stand, where to smile, what to toast. It was a world of champagne and perfect teeth. And I, with my clean blazer and pressed collar, didn't fit their definition of family anymore. I was too quiet, too used, too old. Once my name was on everything, her school forms, emergency contacts, graduation invites. I taught her how to sign her name, helped her practice for interviews, paid her first month's rent in the city she now loved more than the house she was raised in. But tonight, my name wasn't even good enough to get me a seat at her engagement party. I nodded to the guard, didn't argue. I wasn't raised to beg for entry into something I paid for. I walked back to the car, slowly, letting the weight of every unspoken memory press against my chest. I thought of the nights I stayed up waiting for her to get home safe. The mornings I sat at the edge of her bed, just to be sure she was still breathing during her darkest years. And now she breathed just fine. She just breathed without me. A couple walked past me as I reached the driveway. The woman whispered, "Isn't that her grandfather?" The man shook his head. No, I think he's the driver. He's always by the car. They passed. They didn't turn back. I sat in the vehicle, folded my hands, let the engine hum quietly, like a lullaby I once used to sing her. And somewhere between the hum and the silence, I realized something. This wasn't just a moment. This was a mirror. They had placed me outside, but she had left me out a long time ago. Not with cruelty, with comfort. Because comfort forgets the hands that held it up. And comfort rarely thanks the ones who bled to make it feel safe. But the thing about being outside the door is, you see the house more clearly. You hear what people inside try to hide. And tonight, I wasn't just going to drive. I was going to remember. And I was going to be remembered. The door opened. For a moment, the light from inside poured out like a golden flood. Warm, alive, full of music and voices that didn't know my name anymore. And there she was, my granddaughter. She stepped out carefully, holding the edges of her gown so it wouldn't brush against the wet gravel. White silk, embroidered lace, the kind of dress little girls once drew in crayons, dreaming of their big day, and now here she stood, all grown up, shimmering like something untouchable. For a second she looked at me, just a second. Her eyes met mine, that same deep brown I used to see light up every time I brought home a surprise or fixed her broken doll. But now those eyes didn't shine the same. They hesitated, measured, glanced away too quickly as if eye contact was something dangerous. She gave a half smile, not the kind that says, "I'm happy to see you." The kind that says, "Don't make this harder than it already is." Her heels clicked gently on the driveway as she stepped closer, but not too close. Her hands stayed at her sides, not reaching for a hug, not even a touch to my shoulder. I waited, but nothing came. She looked around to make sure no one was watching, then leaned in just slightly. "Hey, thanks for coming," she said, her voice low, rushed. He doesn't like too much family drama. Can you stay near the car? Just for tonight?" That was it. Just for tonight, like I hadn't given her my whole life. And he, the fiancé, the man who had never sat across from me for more than 5 minutes, who had never asked how she survived without her parents, who had never thanked the man who filled the silence after the sirens left that night. He didn't like family drama, as if my presence was the risk, as if I, the man who taught her how to tie her shoes and write an apology letter, might somehow ruin the illusion of perfection they were selling tonight. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because the lump in my throat had no words to offer back. She turned before I could say anything, walked back to the door, and just before it closed behind her, I saw her look back, barely. A flicker, something between guilt and habit. But the door shut, and the golden light disappeared. I stood there, hands in my pockets, the chill settling deep into my bones, my feet aching not from standing, but from years of walking beside someone who, somewhere along the road, stopped looking back. That night, as the music grew louder and her laughter floated through open windows, I realized something far colder than the wind around me. I was no longer her foundation. I had become her footnote. And footnotes don't get invitations. They just wait quietly outside, dressed in memories no one wants to read aloud. The door creaked open again. Not soft this time, not with hesitation, but with the firm confidence of someone who believed the world belonged to him. It was him, the fiancé. He stepped out with the air of someone inspecting property. His suit was spotless. His shoes shimmered even under the dim garden lights. Every part of him looked curated, like he had rehearsed being admired. He didn't walk, he glided, not from grace, but from entitlement. And then he saw me. I straightened instinctively, out of habit, out of that old ingrained reflex to show respect, even when it's not returned. He looked me up and down like I was a waiting car instead of a waiting man. A few seconds passed before he said a word, and when he did, it wasn't a greeting. "You're the driver, right?" The way he said it, flat, dismissive, wasn't a question. It was a label, a confirmation of my assigned place in the hierarchy of his perfect evening. I nodded slowly, not because that's all I was, but because arguing with a man who doesn't see you is like shouting at a brick wall and expecting it to bleed. He smirked, a practiced, self-satisfied smirk. "Figures," he said. You've got that humble look. Humble. That word hit harder than he could have known, not because it was wrong, but because it was all he saw. The calloused hands, the cheap watch, the shoes worn at the edges. To him it all screamed. Small. Forgettable. Convenient. He turned and walked off before I could even respond. Not that I would have. His attention span for people like me had clearly expired the moment he confirmed I wasn't a threat to his spotlight. He didn't know I was the one who'd driven her to her first job interview when she couldn't afford the bus. That I was the one who helped her move into her dorm, carrying every box up 4 flights of stairs while she cried in the hallway because she missed her parents. That I was the one who stayed up every night during her final year of school, making tea, listening to her panic, never letting her quit. He didn't know that when she had no one, I was the one who stood. But none of that mattered now, because he saw a driver, not a man, not her past, not her anchor, just someone who parked neatly and disappeared. And still I didn't move, not because I was frozen, but because I knew if I moved, something in me would crack. And pride is a fragile thing when you've already swallowed so much silence. So I stood there, on that gravel driveway, heart pounding not from anger, but from a deeper ache. An ache that comes when the person you raised forgets that love isn't loud or dressed in tailored suits. That real love drives, waits, listens, sacrifices, and does it all quietly. He disappeared through the front door. Laughter erupted again inside. Applause followed. A toast, perhaps, or maybe an announcement. I didn't hear the words. All I heard was my own breath, steady, slow. I reached into my coat and pulled out the old photo I kept in my pocket. The one of her at 5 years old, sitting on my shoulders, grinning with ice cream smeared across her cheek. I looked at that photo for a long time, and I wondered, not if she remembered me, but if she remembered herself. From the far edge of the driveway, I could just make out the back corner of the house, where the kitchen windows faced out toward the garden. The curtains had been pulled, but someone had forgotten to close them completely. Just enough light spilled through the narrow slit that I could see part of the dining room beyond it. That's where the toasts were happening. I stood alone in the darkness, hands resting on the roof of the car, the cool metal grounding me as voices inside rose with joy. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed too loud. Then another. Then a ripple of applause. I couldn't hear the words clearly, but I didn't need to. I knew that rhythm. I'd watched it unfold a dozen times. The way people stand, lift their glass, offer a memory, a joke, a wish. But my name was never called. No one said to Joseph, the man who raised her. No one said to the grandfather who never let her fall. Not even a mention, not even a whisper. The table was long, dressed in white linen and crystal. Every seat filled with people dressed in silk, velvet, and importance. But there was one empty chair, third from the head on the left. I knew that chair. I had seen it on the seating chart she showed me months ago. "That'll be yours, Grandpa," she had said, tapping the paper gently, her eyes soft with promise. "You'll be right beside me." But tonight, that chair sat untouched. No plate, no glass, just absence. And absence has a shape. It stretches across rooms. It weighs down laughter. It hums beneath music. It reminds you that your name is now too inconvenient to say out loud. I pressed my hand to the window glass. Not to knock, not to interrupt, just to feel something. It was warm on the inside, a little foggy from the heat of celebration. I stood there for a long moment, watching her silhouette, my granddaughter, lift her glass and smile as he spoke beside her. I remembered that smile. She used to flash it at me through car windows when I picked her up from school. She used to grin like that when she showed me her report cards, when we baked cookies and she spilled flour all over the floor, when we danced in the living room to music from a dusty old radio. That smile had once been a beacon, a little flicker of hope in a house that had lost too much too soon. But tonight it wasn't mine. It belonged to this world now, the one behind the curtain, the one where I was no longer welcome, where my name wasn't on the guest list, where my stories were too long, too quiet, Too much of a reminder of things no one wanted to remember anymore. I stepped back slowly. The gravel crunched under my feet, a sound no one inside would hear. I walked around to the side of the house where the garden was quieter, where old hydrangeas I had once helped her plant now stood overgrown, half forgotten. She used to call them Grandpa's flowers, said they only bloomed because I talked to them. I reached out and brushed a petal. It crumbled slightly in my fingers, dry, brittle. Funny how even flowers forget who raised them. I sat back in the car, the engine off, the world muffled. I didn't cry. I think something deeper than tears had taken hold of me. Something hollow, not rage, not sorrow, just that quiet ache of being erased. You don't need to be told you're not wanted. Sometimes silence is louder than rejection. And tonight, that silence screamed, not in my face, but behind a curtain, at an empty chair, in a name never spoken. I was her grandfather, but only in blood now, not in presence, not in name, not in heart. I sat behind the wheel long after the night had swallowed the estate and its laughter. The engine was off, but the car's interior light glowed faintly, illuminating my weathered hands on the steering wheel, the same hands that once gripped a child's trembling fingers. Outside, the gravel driveway stretched into darkness, but inside, memories flooded in, one after another. I remembered the late autumn evening when I found her curled against the doorframe of her old room, tears running down her cheeks, because the neighborhood kids teased her for wearing her mother's old coat. I scooped her into the back seat and drove her to the hill where city lights spilled like spilled paint, and we sat under the stars until she stopped shaking. She leaned against the door, eyes closed, clutching my jacket as if it were a shield. I remembered the recital, the night she forgot her sheet music and froze under the spotlight. I was backstage, gripping the car keys so tightly I feared they'd break. When she faltered on stage, I crept onto the dim wings, handed her the folded pages, and she played the final notes with every ounce of courage I'd poured into her. I remembered the hospital corridors, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, where I paced from room to room as she lay recovering from surgery. Every beeping machine was a countdown, and I refused to sit down until her breath steadied. When she woke and saw me in the doorway, her eyes flickered with relief, because I was there, always there. I remembered the rainy morning she missed the bus and sobbed at the curb, clutching her backpack like it was slipping away. I pulled up in this very car, door swinging open, and she climbed in, rain dripping from her hair, then turned and threw herself into my arms. Her tears soaked my shirt, and I told her that storms pass, and that's what I would always be, her umbrella. All those nights, all those drives, I wasn't just a chauffeur. I was her comfort when the world felt too big. I was her listener when no one else paused to hear. I was the keeper of her secrets, the builder of quiet victories, the silent guardian of every heartbreak she never spoke aloud. But now, in the hush of the driveway, none of that mattered. The car seats held ghosts of laughter and whispered fears, but the house across the lawn had forgotten their meaning. She didn't need a driver anymore. She needed a symbol, a centerpiece, someone who fit neatly into the stained glass narrative of her big, beautiful day. I sank lower into the seat and closed my eyes, feeling the vinyl press into my shoulders. My heart ached with a weight I couldn't name. Regret, maybe, that I'd given so much without teaching her to see me. Or sorrow, that a lifetime of devotion could be reduced to a uniform and a steering wheel. I thought of the miles we'd traveled together, the winding country roads, city streets, the highways leading to new beginnings. She once asked me, "Grandpa, will you drive me to where dreams start?" And I promised I would, wheels turning at my command. But dreams change directions without warning, and tonight, I realized, so did people. I wiped a hand across my cheek, but no tears came. Just a fierce longing to remind her of every mile behind us, every silent vigil, every whispered lullaby. I wanted her to remember that behind every journey she took, I was there, not just to steer, but to hold her up when the road grew dark. I turned the key in the ignition and felt the engine's heartbeat beneath me. I could leave, drive until the early dawn when the world was new again, but leaving would be another kind of forgetting. So I sat, and I remembered, and I waited, because sometimes memories behind the wheel don't come with a map. They come with hope. Hope that one day someone will trace the tire tracks and say, "There was a man who drove me home." The night air was thick and still when a young staff boy approached the car, his flashlight shaking in nervous hands. He tapped my window, the beam bouncing off the glass until it settled on my face. "They need someone to drive the mayor," he whispered. "He's early." My heart tightened. The mayor, the very man who'd spoken my name in praise at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for that community center I funded years ago. The man whose son learned carpentry because of my old workshop down Main Street. I remembered how proud she'd been when I introduced them, her arm looped through mine in gratitude. Now I was a stranger on her driveway, summoned only to ferry an official guest. I didn't argue. I slid out, straightening the creases in my jacket as I pulled the door closed behind me. My cap sat heavy on my head, a silent reminder of all the times I'd climbed into the seat at dawn or dusk. Not for celebration, but for necessity. School runs, midnight hospital trips, emergency detours through rain-soaked streets. Always the driver. But tonight, the driver for someone I'd never met, under the glow of a chandelier that wouldn't shine for me. As I climbed in, the car seat molded around me like an old friend, its worn leather whispering memories. The boy jumped in the back, nervously clutching his clipboard, and directed me down the winding gravel path. I pulled away, tires crunching, the house receding until only the faint halo around its windows remained. The roads were empty, the world hushed, and yet every street lamp felt like an accusation. I rounded a sharp bend and saw the mayor's car idling under a lamppost, the same one I'd parked under for late-night talks with my granddaughter, planning her future as if it were a story waiting to unfold. I stopped beside him and climbed out to open the door. Inside sat the mayor, his tie loosened, forehead furrowed with the weight of protocol and expectation. I didn't speak. I just nodded and slid behind the wheel again. The engine sparked to life, and we merged onto the silent avenue. The mayor exhaled, and I could almost hear the years of speeches he'd given about unity and memory. He'd forgotten me, or perhaps never truly known me. But here in the metal shell of my car, I was his means to arrive, just as I'd once been hers. We drove through empty streets, past shuttered shops, moonlight glinting off wet pavement. The silence between us carried ghosts of conversations I'd never have the chance to share. I thought of her laughter, echoing in these same corridors when she was a little girl. I thought of every mile I'd driven so she could chase her dreams, every detour I'd taken to keep her safe. When we returned, the mayor stepped out and saluted me with a grateful nod. "Thank you," he said, voice hushed. For once, I allowed those words to settle. I watched him disappear inside the grand house, his silhouette swallowed by the golden light. I sat in the car for a moment longer, the engine ticking as it cooled. The staff boy peeked around the front fender. "You can stay until after the ceremony, if you'd like," he offered, but I shook my head. I didn't need another seat at a table that wouldn't call my name. I started the engine again and backed onto the driveway, headlights illuminating the hydrangeas I'd planted alongside her when she was 10. They bloomed indifferently in the moonlight, petals soft and pale. I pressed my hand to the steering wheel, feeling its familiar grooves beneath my fingers. In that instant, I realized that every unexpected request, the mayor's ride, the emergency detour, the late-night vigil, had shaped who I was. But tonight, I wasn't just the driver. I was the keeper of memories the world had tried to hide behind closed doors and empty chairs. And as I pulled away into the darkness, I understood that sometimes the journey you least expect becomes the one that reminds you who you truly are. I glanced in the rearview mirror as the mayor slid into the seat behind me, his polished shoes settling firmly on the floor mat. The sudden recognition in his eyes startled me, a spark of memory I hadn't expected in this night of strangers. "Wait," Are you Joseph? He asked, voice gentle, almost reverent. The name felt strange on his lips, like an echo from a life I'd thought buried beneath formalities and polite dismissals. I turned slowly, catching the faint streetlight on his brow. I built the youth center downtown, he continued, tone alive with gratitude. My son learned carpentry there because of your donation. My chest tightened at the memories that rushed back. The day we broke ground on that dusty lot, her small hand in mine as we hammered the first nail together. The afternoons spent sanding benches, teaching neighborhood kids the difference between splinters and smooth edges. I offered him a quiet smile, my voice low with honesty. I just tried to help. For the first time all evening, I felt seen, not as a mere chauffeur or an unwelcome guest, but as the man who poured sweat and hope into that building's foundation. As we navigated quiet streets, his thanks unfolded like sunlight breaking through clouds. He spoke of workshops held there, of young hands shaping wood into tables that fed families, of lives transformed by having a safe place to learn. Each word was a brick laid back into my spirit, reminding me that the impact of kindness endures even when the world forgets your name. And in that narrow back seat, between us and the dark road ahead, I realized that legacy isn't measured by invitations or seats at tables. It's measured by the lives you touch, by the echo of your efforts in voices you may never hear, by the gratitude of strangers who carry your story forward. When he finally asked to be let out at the front entrance, I nodded, understanding that somewhere in those walls, my granddaughter's life had intertwined with mine in ways she had since overlooked. As he stepped away, his parting words lingered. Thank you, Joseph. I watched him disappear into the glow of the house, heart swollen with a quiet triumph. The engine ticked softly, and I knew that even if my name wasn't on the guest list, it would forever be etched in the hearts I'd helped build. By the time I rounded the corner of the veranda, the party's glow had shifted. What was once a seamless wall of laughter and clinking glasses now trembled with murmurs. I paused by the wide-open doors, leaning against the column as if I needed support. Though the weight was not physical, it was the weight of curious eyes, of hushed questions floating through the warm air like restless spirits. Inside, the chandeliers cast a golden haze over silk dresses and tuxedos, but the shimmer had softened. Conversations stalled mid-sip as I appeared at the threshold. A woman in emerald green glanced at her companion, lips moving soundlessly. I caught her eye, and she looked away with a flicker of guilt. A man near the buffet brushed breadcrumbs from his lapel, nodding toward me before lowering his hand as if fearing he'd overstepped. I could almost hear the thread of whispers winding through the hall. The mayor asked for the driver by name? Floated from a small cluster near the piano, faces bright with surprise. Wait, wasn't he some kind of community builder? Someone asked by the flower arrangements, fingertips brushing a petal as though seeking proof. Didn't he raise her when her parents... The words trailed off, unspoken details filling the space with a hush heavier than the music. I stepped inside, each footfall deliberate on the polished floor. The room's warmth enveloped me, but it was broken by the chill of recognition. Eyes followed me, not with malice, but with the sudden realization that someone they had discounted carried stories they would never have offered him. A father glanced at his watch, then nodded at his wife, as if confirming he'd seen correctly. A grandfather paused in his toast, glass halfway to his lips, and lowered it slowly. Their hearts beat a split second out of rhythm, caught between old assumptions and new truths. I walked past the head table to where the hydrangea centerpieces had been arranged in tight circles. The same flowers I'd planted years ago, now freshly trimmed and perfumed. I reached out, fingers brushing once more against the delicate petals. They were no longer brittle. They had been replaced for tonight's celebration, new blossoms, fresh cut, like a life reset. And then I felt it, a subtle shift in the air as if the entire room exhaled at once. The music softened at the keys. A hush fell, not of disrespect, but of reverence. My granddaughter stood at the head of the table, her hand frozen on the back of her fiancé's chair. Their eyes met. I saw her surprise, then shame, then something that trembled between relief and regret. She didn't look away this time. I took a steadying breath, feeling memories stir at the edges of childhood laughter, scraped knees, whispered promises, and I understood that tonight was no longer about being invisible. It was about being seen. Guests parted, a slow, reluctant path clearing. I walked forward, not in triumph, but in quiet dignity. The voices of inside whispers faded behind me, replaced by a new sound, respectful silence. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with a shout. It arrives on hushed lips and turned hearts. And tonight, the hall had finally learned my name. The young man lifted the microphone, his polished cuff glinting in the chandelier's glow. He cleared his throat, chest puffed with self-satisfaction, as if the room hung on his every word. "To new beginnings," he declared, voice confident. "Away from baggage, away from the past. Some people drive, some people arrive." A ripple of laughter chased around the table. A brittle, forced sound that rattled like champagne glasses struck too hard. A few eyebrows rose, quick glances passed between guests. Some smirked, caught between amusement and surprise. Others stiffened, realizing too late how sharply those words cut through the air. I felt my chest tighten. His joke, his thinly veiled dismissal of everything I'd given, hung in the air like a guillotine's blade. He didn't know the miles I'd logged through midnight storms or the detours I'd taken to make sure she was safe. He didn't know the countless sunrises I'd watched from behind the steering wheel, waiting for her to step into a brighter day. The room's laughter stuttered, dying in its tracks. I watched as the mayor, seated beyond the head table, stood. His chair scraped against the floorboards, the single sound echoing louder than any toast. The mayor turned slowly toward the young man, his face solemn under the crystal light. In that moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, silent porcelain, waiting to see which way it would shatter. No one spoke. The guests froze mid-sip, mid-smile as the mayor stepped forward. He reached for the microphone, his hand steady. "I'd like to correct something," he said, voice deep and resonant. "Some people drive, and some people build the roads." A hush fell so complete, it felt like the last layer of noise peeling away. Every eye turned to me. I stood then, unsteadily at first, heart pounding like a bell in a cathedral. The young man's cheeks drained of color. He lowered his gaze as if searching the polished floor for a place to hide. The mayor continued. "Without those roads, without that foundation, none of this," he gestured to the gilded hall, "would be possible." His voice broke just slightly, the tremor of gratitude threading through each word. Joseph drove more than cars. He carried this family, this community, through its darkest hours. A quiet applause began, tentative at first, then stronger, rising like a tide through the room. My granddaughter's eyes glistened with tears as she stood beside me, her hand finding mine across the table. The microphone slipped from the young man's grasp, his power drained in an instant by the weight of truth. And in that powerful silence, richer than any laughter, I felt something lift within me. A release of years spent waiting in shadows. A vindication so deep it resonated in every bone. Because justice isn't a spectacle. It's a moment of recognition. It's when a man's worth is seen not for the role he plays on a stage, but for the roads he laid quietly, faithfully, so others could walk toward their future. The mayor's voice carried across the now quiet hall, cutting through the last murmurs of conversation. "I came early to see the man who made this event possible. Not with money, but with legacy. It wasn't an announcement so much as a benediction, a recognition of something far more profound than any wedding gift or floral arrangement." He turned toward me, his gaze unwavering. "Joseph, please come in." My legs trembled as I stepped forward, each movement feeling like the first time I'd climbed out of this car at dawn to fetch her from some crisis. Only now, the crisis was my own unacknowledged worth. The chandelier light gilded my shoulders as I crossed the threshold, and every face in the room followed me, not with curiosity but with respect. I felt the weight of years lift and settle, not in my bones but in my heart, as memories of midnight drives, tearful goodbyes, whispered comforts, and tireless dedication paraded behind my eyes. I could almost hear the echoes of her childhood laughter entwined with the hum of the engine. Every night spent watching over her distilled into this single moment of reckoning. My granddaughter stood at the head table, hand outstretched, tears glistening like jewels beneath the soft glow, and as I took her hand, the hall exhaled. I wasn't just the driver anymore. I was the man who carried her through darkness into celebration, the silent architect of countless beginnings. And though the music had stopped, a new melody rose in my chest, the steady rhythm of being seen, of being honored, of finally arriving home. A ripple of movement spread through the hall as the first guest rose from his seat, an elderly aunt whose laughter had once filled every holiday dinner, now silent as she offered hesitant applause. Then another stood, a college friend who had coached her through her first heartbreak, his eyes heavy with regret. The clapping began softly, uncertain, as if each person weighed whether they deserved to acknowledge the man they had ignored. Some faces turned down, eyes flicking toward the polished floor, cheeks flushed with shame at the realization that they had treated him like a stranger. Others pressed together in whispered confessions. How could we have forgotten? I didn't even know his name. I watched from the center of the room, heart hammering in my chest, breath coming in uneven rhythms as the sound grew. It was not the raucous cheer of celebration, but something deeper, collective atonement. Each clap felt like a drop of forgiveness, seeping into the cracks of long-held assumptions, mending them stitch by careful stitch. The crystal chandeliers above trembled with light, scattering golden reflections across faces that suddenly looked real again. Real with empathy, real with remorse, real with gratitude. My granddaughter's voice came to me, tremulous. "I didn't know they'd treat you like that." Her whisper drifted across the space between us, raw with guilt and sorrow. Her eyes shone, molten with tears she could not hold back. Yet as the final guests stood, and the applause swelled into a gentle roar, she remained silent, allowing them their moment of recognition. She let them see him, not as the driver at the curb, but as the man whose steady presence had shaped every milestone she celebrated tonight. In that hush between notes of music and echoes of hands meeting in solidarity, I felt a trembling warmth spread through me. It was neither pride nor vindication, but something simpler and more profound. The knowledge that love, even when buried under conventions and misunderstandings, can be uncovered by truth. And though she said nothing more, her eyes spoke volumes, a promise that the man who had always stood by her would never stand alone again. The mayor's hand was warm on my shoulder, a gentle anchor in the sea of faces now turned toward me. The clink of glassware hushed as he straightened, voice firm and kind. "This table, the head table, belongs to builders, not mockers." His words rang like church bells, calling down the walls of pretense and privilege. Then with deliberate grace he reached for a chair beside him. Not the groom's polished seat, gleaming beneath the centerpiece's glow, not a token gesture at some back corner. He pulled out the very place of honor, the chair reserved for those who shaped every path, the man who drove in storms, who labored unseen, who carried more than cars through life's darkest stretches. I watched the chair slide across the floor, its legs whispering on marble, carving a space in history for every silent mile I'd logged. The guests drew a collective breath, as if realizing that an entire story had been condensed into the simple act of setting a seat. My granddaughter's tears fell freely now, catching the light as she met my eyes. I felt her pride and relief, a fierce pulse matching my own heartbeat. Stepping forward, I barely noticed the soft rustle of silk as people shifted to make room. The air felt electric, charged by decades of unspoken gratitude finally finding its voice. As I sat, The cushion seemed to cradle more than my tired bones. It cradled a lifetime of devotion, of midnight drives and whispered reassurances. A kindness so steady that I'd mistaken it for routine. My hand trembled when I reached for my water glass, but the tremor was not fear. It was the tremor of recognition, of knowing that roots buried deep at the edge of visibility had suddenly burst forth into the sunlight. I looked around the table at faces softened by contrition and respect. The colleagues who once questioned my worth, the friends who'd laughed at my station, the family who'd thought they could redefine me with a casual insult. Now they sat in silence, honoring a man they had overlooked. My granddaughter leaned close, voice quivering with emotion. I should have never let them. I'm so sorry. I placed my hand over hers, feeling the warmth of her palm against mine. You've brought me home, I whispered, and there under the crystal glow I realized that true honor isn't given. It's earned and then claimed by love. The mayor raised his glass again, this time not with a toast, but with a quiet nod of respect. The music began anew, softer, richer, as if the strings themselves understood what had shifted in the room. I sat at the head table, not as an afterthought, but as its cornerstone. And in that chair, pulled out for me, for my life's work, I felt the hum of justice settle deep within my bones. A final seat at the table, yes, but also the first seat of a new understanding, that every mile driven, every secret carried, every sacrifice made had led me here, to being seen, being honored, and finally being home. The air shifted as he rose, the fiancé's face pale and tight with anger. His confident stance crumbled under the weight of 100 silent glances. He stormed to his feet, voice trembling. This is ridiculous. But there was no rallying chorus behind him. No friends rose in solidarity. Instead, the hall held its breath, the guests frozen in a collective judgment more cutting than any words. He looked around desperately, for laughter, for a supporting smirk, for even a single nod of approval, but found only sober faces and downcast eyes. The very chairs he had claimed now felt like traps, their elegance mocking him as he slipped between them. The soft rustle of fabric and the quiet scraping of polished shoes on marble were the only sounds as he made toward the exit he'd once opened for me so carelessly. With every step, the distance grew, not just across the room, but between who he thought he was and the truth that had unmasked him. He passed beneath the chandeliers, their crystals scattering light onto his retreating back, each sparkle a reminder of the empathy he had bargained away. The hall watched him go, an audience to his unraveling, and not one soul moved to stop him. The silence that swallowed his departure spoke louder than any shout of triumph. When the door closed behind him, it was as if the world exhaled. A single echo lingered, his footsteps fading into emptiness. In that space, the guests turned back to the head table, where I sat, steady and honored. My granddaughter's hand found mine, and in her grip I felt a tender promise that no one who truly loved her would ever leave her side again. And as the music hesitantly began once more, its notes carried a fresh resonance, a hymn for new beginnings, forged from the ashes of old disrespect. Later that night, long after the last guest had drifted away and the estate lay hushed under a blanket of moonlight, my granddaughter slipped quietly through the garden door and found me still seated at the head table, fingers tracing the carved initials in the wood. The candles had burned low in the remnants of celebration. Crumpled napkins, a lone rose petal, lay scattered across the linen. She sat beside me, her gown whispering against the chair, and for a moment we simply listened to the soft hum of the cooling halls. I called you a driver, she said, voice thick with emotion, but you carried more than any of us ever knew. Her words trembled between us like the last note of a song, fragile yet resonant. I turned toward her, seeing in her eyes the flicker of the little girl who once clung to my coat in thunderous storms, the young woman who leaned on me during dark nights, and now this strong woman who reached out for my hand in quiet understanding. I took her hand in mine, feeling the delicate weight of her ring as it slid against my skin. "Don't honor me with words," I whispered, voice hoarse with gratitude and years of unspoken hope. "Do better with your life. Let kindness be your legacy, and never forget whose hands taught you to drive through the storms." My words were not a rebuke, but a blessing, an invitation to carry forward the compassion I'd tried to teach, to build roads for others to follow, unseen yet unwavering. She leaned her head on my shoulder, the soft arc of her hair warm against my cheek, and I felt the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, proof that in this moment she had remembered everything I had ever tried to give her. The night held us in its gentle embrace, and in the silence that followed, there was no place for empty titles or hollow roles. There was only family, bound not by obligation or ceremony, but by the countless miles we had traveled together, the countless moments she had let me carry her. And under the silver light of a forgiving moon, we sat side by side, two souls intertwined by love's quiet endurance, knowing that at last I had my true title back. Not driver, not staff, but her grandfather, and she was truly mine again.